The removal of Confederate monuments and memorials is an ongoing process in the United States since the 1960s. Many municipalities in the United States have removed monuments and memorials on public property dedicated to the Confederate States of America and the killing of George Floyd. The removals have been driven by the belief that the monuments glorify white supremacy, memorialize and unrecognized treasonous government, the Confederacy, whose founding principle was the perpetuation and expansion of slavery, and that the presence of these Confederate memorials over 100 years after the defeat of the Confederacy continues to disenfranchise and alienate African Americans. The vast majority of these Confederate monuments were built during the era of Jim Crow laws, from 1877 to 1964. Detractors claim that they were not built as memorials but as a means of intimidating African Americans and reaffirming white supremacy after the Civil War. The monuments have thus become highly politicized. According to Eleanor Harvey, a senior curator at the Smithsonian American Art Museum and a scholar of Civil War history, if white nationalists and neo-Nazis are now claiming this as part of their heritage, they have essentially co-opted those images and those statues beyond any capacity to neutralize them again. In a counter-reaction to the movement to remove Confederate monuments, some southern states passed state laws restricting or prohibiting the removal or alteration of public monuments. As part of the protests that followed the killing of George Floyd in 2020, there was a new wave of removal of Confederate monuments. An Alabama law prohibiting the removal of historical monuments was deliberately broken by the mayor of Birmingham, Alabama, the City Council of Anniston, Alabama, and others. The mayor said that the penalty fine was preferable to the unrest that would follow if it were not removed. The governor of North Carolina removed, on the grounds of public safety, 3 Confederate monuments at the North Carolina Capitol that the legislature had in effect made illegal to remove. The U.S. Army said it would rename Fort Bragg and its other military bases named for Confederate generals. The U.S. Navy and U.S. Marines prohibited the display of the Confederate flag, even as bumper stickers on private cars on base. A wave of corporate product rebranding has also ensued. During the George Floyd protests, the campaign to remove monuments extended to outside the United States. Numerous statues and other public works of art related to the transatlantic slave trade and European colonialism around the world were either removed or destroyed. Most of the Confederate monuments concerned were built in periods of racial conflict, such as when Jim Crow laws were being introduced in the late 19th century and at the start of the 20th century, or during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. These two periods also coincided with the 50th anniversary and the American Civil War centennial. The peak in construction of Civil War monuments occurred between the late 1890s up to 1920, with a second, smaller peak in the late 1950s to mid-1960s, according to historian Jane Daly from University of Chicago. In many cases, the purpose of the monuments was not to celebrate the past but rather to promote a white supremacist future. Another historian, Karen Cox, from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, has written that the monuments are a legacy of the brutally racist Jim Crow era. A historian from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, James Lalaudes, stated that the funders and backers of these monuments are very explicit that they are requiring a political education and a legitimacy for the Jim Crow era and the right of white men to rule. Adam Goodhart, Civil War author and director of the Starr Center at Washington College, stated in National Geographic, "They're 20th century artifacts in the sense that a lot of it had to do with a vision of national unity that embraced Southerners as well as Northerners, but importantly still excluded black people." In an August 2017 statement on the monuments controversy, the American Historical Association said that to remove a monument is not to erase history, but rather to alter or call attention to a previous interpretation of history. The AHA stated that most monuments were erected without anything resembling a democratic process, and recommended that it was time to reconsider these decisions. According to the AHA, most Confederate monuments were erected during the late 19th and early 20th century. And this undertaking was part and parcel of the initiation of legally mandated segregation and widespread disenfranchisement across the South. According to the AHA, memorials to the Confederacy erected during this period were intended, in part, to obscure the terrorism required to overthrow Reconstruction, and to intimidate African Americans. PO.